Hello and welcome to the GrapeSEED Official Podcast. We keep coming with new content ideas for you all out there. Today's new series was inspired by Team Japan, both coaches and teachers. Recently, the GrapeSEED Japan team has been holding weekly calls with interested teachers over a variety of topics, from teaching upper units to classroom management to simply how teachers set up their classrooms. One of the unique aspects of these calls is that while the coaches in Japan facilitate the talks, teachers sharing their ideas is the main focus. I've had the opportunity to listen to just about all of them at this point, and I was struck by how much good content was on these recordings. So much so that I wanted to highlight some of the best clips from them on the podcast so that everyone can listen internationally. For this first installment, I wanted to highlight some clips from a special talk the Japan team did where they held a question and answer session with teachers and Kelly Young, GrapeSEED's Vice President of Product Innovation. Teachers could submit their questions in advance or ask Kelly directly. Enjoy listening to Kelly's thoughtful answers with a small cameo from both Miklos and friend of the show, Greg.
A couple of years ago, some new materials, new components were added to the curriculum, like I Always Like Today and Rude Kitty, among others. What was the thought process and behind figuring out what language needs extra reinforcement and designing those things to be used?
First of all, thank you all for having me here today, because I was telling Miklos and Grace yesterday, one of the things that I miss the most since COVID happened is I don't get to get out to the classrooms and see teachers and students. So it's very exciting to talk with you guys today. So to answer that question, we did have some new components. We actually had a lot of changes in what we call GrapeSEED 2020 or our fourth version. And the way that happened was our curriculum had been in use for quite some time at that point. And we had been collecting feedback from teachers for like 10 years for some of the units about what worked and what didn't work. And over that same time, we also noted some areas where we thought more support could be provided for students. So, for example, just something little, we looked at the phonogram word cards, and some of the words that were on the phonogram word cards, the kids had not learned yet. So we wanted to make sure that they had exposure and understanding of the words that were also being used on the word cards. We also looked at vocabulary or language functions that maybe didn't have enough exposure or repetition. And then we also needed to make some changes based on the implementation models that schools were using now. So as we grew, so did the different kinds of implementation models. So we had to look at, we did a lot of data gathering across all of our countries and all of our classrooms to find out like, kind of what's the average or, what can we expect teachers to be able to do? And so one of the things that we did for that was we looked at how many units per year that we could expect classrooms to get through. And I know this is going to blow you away, but originally GrapeSEED was developed to teach 10 units a year. And so that was because some of our original classes were 2 hours a day. And so in 5 days a week. And so some of our things were not really age appropriate. So they were developed for 4-year-olds for unit 1 through 10. And then by the time you get up to 15, the ages are very different than what our actual students are. We also looked at changing from just the same number of exposures for every component to looking at the complexity of the component. So how many language functions or vocabulary are in the component? How many of them are new? And we looked at changing that up a little bit to make sure that the components that needed more exposure were getting it, and the components that kids can learn in 7 or 10 exposures aren't still needing 20 exposures to get through. We saw that some of the kids were getting a little bored with some of the easier components. And then we moved some things around just to make sure things were age appropriate. I also visited, when I first started, I went to almost every country and visited just a ton of classrooms. And I was able to talk to teachers about what was working and what wasn't working for them, how different implementation models affected the learning of students, what students actually were struggling with. And then we took all of that information and we made some changes. Some of the big changes that we made were we heard a lot that kids were struggling with reading, especially when they got to like Unit 21. But we noticed that kids were struggling a little bit sooner than that. And we really wanted reading to be a little more effortless. And so we wanted to make sure that when kids started reading, they had enough exposure to the words they were reading that it made sense to them. So they weren't trying to figure out comprehension, trying to figure out the meaning of the words while they were also trying to decode them. That's a lot to go on in your brain at the same time. So we added also assembly at that time because if you were not here before then, I know some of you have been here longer than me, but if you were not here before then, we used to have assembly word cards. And they would just be missing certain letters, right? Well, the problem with those is that assembly is really it's a dynamic process that involves action of like putting things together. And when you have a static card, it didn't really help students. So we incorporated assembly again. We added basic readers. And then we also realigned, if you notice, some of the phonograms moved units. And we needed to do that to align with the new reading. And then we also did a complete analysis of vocabulary and language functions. And we looked at every single one of the 4,500 words and how many times it was used after it was introduced. We try to put vocabulary in, and we use something called spaced repetition. So we want them to have enough exposure in the unit that we introduce it, but then we also want to keep reviewing it at specific intervals so that kids can move that from short-term memory to long-term memory.
Goodbye, my friends, goodbye. I'm sad to say goodbye. It was a good day, but now I will say goodbye, my friends, goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.